If you've never been there, it's vast, over 500,000 acres of dense trees, rolling hills, and stretches of land where you can walk for miles without seeing another soul. I was there for a week-long hunting trip, alone. I'd done it before. I wasn't reckless. I had my rifle, my GPS, and enough supplies to last me twice the trip's length in case things went south. I wasn't new to hunting, either. I grew up tracking deer with my dad in the Catskills. I knew how to follow a trail, how to read the land, how to stay unseen. But nothing I'd learned prepared me for what I found, or rather, what found me. The trip started out as planned. I parked my truck at the Timberline trailhead and hiked about 6 miles in, set up camp near an old logging road, and scouted the area for signs of deer. The forest was quiet, peaceful in that eerie way it gets when the wind dies down and all you hear is your own breathing. I saw the usual tracks: whitetail, raccoon, maybe a coyote or two. Nothing unusual. I spent the first day settling in, getting a feel for the terrain. It was on the second night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Not the small rustling of a raccoon or the cautious steps of a deer. This was different. Heavy. Deliberate. I reached for my rifle, held my breath, and listened. The steps circled my tent once, then stopped. Just silence. A long, aching silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. Then, slowly, the steps retreated into the woods, fading into nothing. The next morning, I found tracks. Large, human-like footprints in the damp earth. But they weren't quite right. Too long, too narrow, and whatever made them was walking barefoot. No sane person hikes barefoot this deep in the woods. I tried to shake it off. Maybe some lost camper. Maybe a trick of the light. I buried the unease and went about my day, but something had shifted. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It felt watchful. Later that day, I found something else. About a mile from my camp, in a clearing near a stream, there was a deer carcass. Not unusual, except this one hadn't been killed by a hunter or an animal. Its body was untouched, no bite marks, no gunshot wound, but its neck was completely twisted around, its head facing backward. Like something had grabbed it and just turned it. I've seen mountain lions take down deer. I've seen bears scavenge. But I've never seen anything do this. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't just circle my tent. They stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, deep, slow, steady. I held my rifle tight, finger on the trigger, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. And then, whistling. A slow, tuneless whistle, just beyond the fabric of my tent. My blood turned to ice. It whistled for a minute. Maybe 2. Then, without another sound, it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was out there. I packed up camp, shouldered my rifle, and started back toward my truck. It should have taken me a couple of hours, maybe 3 if I took my time. But an hour in, I realized something was wrong. I wasn't getting any closer. The GPS said I was headed the right way, but the terrain looked wrong. The landmarks I marked were where they should be. The trees seemed unfamiliar. It was like the forest itself had shifted when I wasn't looking. That's when I saw the second deer carcass. This one was fresher. Same as before, untouched, but its head completely turned around. But this time, something was different. This time, someone had carved a message into the tree above it. Just one word. Run. I turned and bolted. I ran. I didn't think, didn't check my GPS, didn't try to make sense of anything. I just ran. My boots pounded against the damp earth, my breath came in ragged gasps, and every instinct screamed at me to move. The forest blurred around me, trees flashing past in streaks of brown and green, but no matter how far I went, I never felt like I was getting anywhere. The terrain looked the same: endless trees, dense underbrush, no sign of the logging road that should have led me back to my truck. After what felt like an eternity, my lungs burned, my legs ached, and I forced myself to stop. I was drenched in sweat, my heartbeat a relentless drum in my ears. I pulled out my GPS, desperate for confirmation that I wasn't lost, but the screen flickered and glitched, showing coordinates that made no sense. My compass spun erratically. Even my watch was acting up, frozen at 3:03 p.m., but I knew it had to be later. The forest was silent. Too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of wildlife. Just that heavy, suffocating stillness. And then, the whistling. It came from behind me. Slow, tuneless, and impossibly close. My whole body locked up. I turned, rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Just trees stretching endlessly in all directions. The whistling continued. Not moving. Not fading. Just there. A sound that should have been carried by a human voice, but didn't feel like it belonged to anything living. I took a step back, then another, my fingers tightening around the rifle stock. My mind screamed at me to move, but I felt trapped in place, the way a deer freezes when it knows it's being hunted. My breath came shallow. The moment stretched on forever. Then the whistling stopped. The silence after was worse. I forced myself to move. I turned, gripping my rifle with white-knuckle fingers, and started walking, fast, deliberate steps, ignoring the tremble in my hands. I had to find the road. Had to get back to my truck. Had to get the hell out of these woods. My GPS was useless, my compass was useless, but I knew the general direction. I could still get out. The first sign that something was wrong came about 15 minutes later. I saw my own boot prints in the dirt. Not old ones. Fresh. I stopped cold, my breath catching in my throat. I knelt down, touching the impressions in the damp soil. They matched mine exactly. The same deep-set heel strike, the same pattern from my hunting boots. But I'd never walked this way before. I was moving in circles. Panic started creeping in. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay calm. Getting lost in the woods can mess with your head. If you don't have a clear landmark, it's easy to get turned around without realizing it. I just needed to slow down, retrace my steps carefully, and a twig snapped. Not behind me. Not in front. To my left. Something was in the trees. I turned, rifle raised, scanning the underbrush. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, the dimming light of afternoon casting everything in an eerie, golden haze. My pulse hammered in my skull. Nothing moved. I took a cautious step forward, eyes locked on the tree line. The hair on my arms stood on end. The quiet was thick, pressing against me like a weight. I had the overwhelming sensation that if I took my eyes off the trees, if I so much as blinked, something would move. Something would step out. I backed away. Another snap. Louder this time. Something was there. Watching me. Then I saw it. A shape. Just barely visible between the trees. A figure, tall and unmoving. Too far to make out details, but I knew it was staring at me. It didn't move, didn't shift. Just stood there. I aimed my rifle. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, dry. "Who's there?" No response. No movement. Just silence. I took a step forward, keeping my rifle trained on the figure. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Then, as if breaking the world in half, it moved. Not in a normal way. Not like a man stepping out cover. It moved wrong, a sudden, jarring shift, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. One moment it was still. The next, it was closer. Too close. I fired. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the trees like a cannon blast. Birds erupted from the branches above me, startled into flight. My ears rang, but the figure was gone. I didn't see it run, didn't see it dodge. 1 second it was there. The next, the space it occupied was empty. I stood there, chest heaving, my breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. My hands trembled as I lowered my rifle. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Then, the whistling returned. This time, it was closer. And it was coming from all around me. The whistling came from everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. A sound that should have been carried by a single set of lips, but now seemed to echo from the trees themselves, like the forest was breathing it. Slow, tuneless, wrong. I moved. Didn't think, just moved. My feet pounded against the ground as I ran blindly through the trees, rifle clutched tight, branches whipping against my arms and face. I didn't care where I was headed anymore, didn't care if I was going in circles. I just knew I needed distance between myself and whatever was out there. I ran until my lungs burned, until the whistling faded into the distance, until I felt like I could breathe again. When I finally stopped, I doubled over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. Sweat dripped down my face despite the cold, my pulse hammering against my skull. I checked my surroundings, nothing but endless forest stretching out in every direction. No sign of the figure. No more whistling. For the first time since this started, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun it. Then I looked down. My stomach dropped. At my feet was another deer carcass, its body untouched, no blood, no torn flesh, just the neck twisted completely around, its lifeless eyes staring up at me in horror. But this time, there was something different. Something that turned my fear into a deep, gut-wrenching dread. The deer was still warm. It had been killed minutes ago, which meant I wasn't alone. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, rifle raised, but there was nothing. Just trees. Just the silence of the forest, heavier than ever. The air was thick, electric, charged with something unseen. I took a slow step back, then another, my boots crunching in the fallen leaves. My every instinct screamed at me to move, but I forced myself to stay still, listening, watching. Then a whisper, low, barely audible, drifted through the trees. Turn around. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't my own voice. It wasn't an echo. It was coming from behind me. But I knew that if I turned, if I looked, I wouldn't be looking at something human. My grip tightened on my rifle, hands slick with sweat. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close I should have felt breath on my neck. Turn around. I closed my eyes, steeled myself, and then I ran, again. Not away from the voice, but straight ahead, deeper into the trees. My legs ached, my chest burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw it, a road. Not the logging road I'd camped near, a paved road. A real road. Civilization. I barreled toward it, lungs screaming for air. The asphalt was cracked, weathered by years of neglect, but I didn't care. I was out. I had made it. Or so I thought. Just as I reached the road, as I stumbled onto the pavement, heart hammering against my ribs, I saw the sign. A wooden marker, old, worn by time, standing just off the roadside. Welcome to Blackwell, Pa. And beneath it, a smaller sign nailed into the wood. Population, 0. I stood there, gasping, staring. Population, 0, that didn't make sense. That wasn't possible. And then I heard it. The whistling. Not distant. Not fading. Right behind me. I didn't turn around. I wanted to, I needed to, but some deep, primal instinct locked my body in place. My fingers curled so tight around my rifle that my knuckles ached, my breath coming fast and shallow. The whistling was close, too close, a slow and deliberate tune that seemed to curl around me like invisible fingers. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Every cell in my body knew that whatever was behind me wasn't something I wanted to see. I forced myself to move. A slow step forward, then another. The road stretched in both directions, empty and cracked, the faded lines barely visible beneath years of neglect. It should have been a relief, a way out, but something about it was all wrong. There were no tire tracks in the dirt along the edges, no distant hum of cars, no signs of life at all. The world felt abandoned, frozen in some unnatural state where I had no business existing. The whistling stopped. My breath caught in my throat. The silence was worse. Thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. My heart pounded against my ribs as I forced myself to keep walking, one cautious step at a time. The forest on either side of the road loomed over me, dense and unwelcoming, the kind of dark that swallowed everything whole. I glanced at the population, zero sign again, my mind struggling to make sense of it. There was no such place as Blackwell, Pennsylvania, not one that I had ever heard of, not one that should be here. Then the road changed. At first, I thought my vision was playing tricks on me, that the adrenaline and exhaustion were distorting what I was seeing. But as I walked, I knew the road was stretching, lengthening. The cracks in the asphalt expanded, the distant bends pulling further and further away as if something unseen was making more of it right in front of me. My boots crunched against gravel that hadn't been there moments before. I turned my head, staring back the way I came, and my stomach dropped. The road behind me was gone. The way I had come, the trees that had once framed the path back to the woods, had shifted into something else. It was all forest now. My lungs seized. The road had trapped me. I bolted. I didn't think about where I was running, I just ran. My boots pounded against the pavement, the echo of my footsteps bouncing unnaturally against the trees. The cracks in the asphalt twisted into jagged patterns beneath my feet, shifting and pulsing like veins in living flesh. My breaths came sharp and fast, my rifle clutched uselessly in my grip. I didn't know what I was running toward, but I knew what I was running from. Then I saw the first house. It stood at the bend in the road, half hidden behind overgrown trees. A small, single-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof, like it had been sitting here for decades without a soul to tend to it. The windows were dark, hollow, but the door was slightly ajar. There were no cars, no driveways, no power lines. Just a house, alone, in the middle of the nowhere that shouldn't exist. Then I saw the other houses. More of them, scattered along the road, all in the same state of abandonment. Their porches sagged, their shutters hung loose, their walls warped from years of decay. There were no signs of life, no lights in the windows, no distant voices. Just a dead town, waiting. I skidded to a stop in the center of the road, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I turned in a slow circle, my mind trying to reject what I was seeing. The town stretched further than it should have, twisting out in impossible angles, houses stacked together in ways that made no architectural sense. Some of the doors hung open, dark voids leading into nothing. Others were nailed shut from the outside. A sound scraped through the silence. Not the whistling. Not footsteps. A slow creak. My head snapped toward it. One of the houses, the closest one, had its door swinging open. On its own. A chill rolled down my spine. The air was thick, stagnant, the kind of stillness that came before something moved. I stepped back. My boots scuffed against the pavement, the sound jarringly loud in the unnatural quiet. Then I saw it. Inside the house, past the open door, in the dark of the entryway, a figure. Tall. Motionless. Watching me. It stood just beyond the threshold, just far enough back that I couldn't see its face. Only the vague shape of it, the unnatural stillness of its posture, the way the darkness seemed to cling to it like a second skin. My pulse pounded against my skull. I tightened my grip on the rifle, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to get away, to turn, to run. But I didn't. Because something else caught my attention. The other doors were opening. Not just one. All of them. Up and down the road, house after house, doors slowly creaking open in eerie unison. Each one revealing another figure standing inside, watching. They didn't step forward. They didn't move. They just stood there, silent, waiting. And then, from deep within the town, carried on the still, breathless air, the whistling returned. Slow, tuneless, coming from everywhere at once. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, without looking, without caring where my feet took me as long as it was away from them. The road beneath me felt wrong, stretching and twisting like it wasn't really meant to be here. The air had weight, pressing down on me, making every breath feel like I was pulling in something thick and sickly. Behind me, the whistling never stopped. It didn't fade into the distance as I sprinted, didn't waver or slow. It just followed, curling through the dead town like a presence in itself, a sound that belonged to something I couldn't see but knew was coming. The houses blurred past me, empty structures with open doors and waiting figures standing just inside, never stepping out, never chasing, just watching. I caught glimpses as I ran, shadows against doorways, hollow black eyes peering through cracked windows, motionless, expectant. They weren't people. Not really. Not anymore. The thought burned in my skull, but I didn't let myself process it. I didn't want to. Then, ahead, something shifted. The road, it ended. Not in a normal way. Not a dead end. Not a cul-de-sac. It just stopped. The pavement crumbled into nothing, the world past it swallowed in thick, rolling fog that stretched in all directions like the town itself had been carved out of reality and left hanging over an endless drop. I skidded to a stop inches from the edge, boots kicking up dust as I almost tumbled forward into the void. My lungs burned as I turned back toward the way I'd come, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear, but as I looked down the road, something changed. The town wasn't abandoned anymore. Figures now stood in the streets. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They lined the sidewalks, filled the porches, stood in doorways that had once been empty. Their faces were wrong, stretched and warped like something had worn them out, left them hollow and used up. No expressions, no emotions, just vacancy. They didn't move, didn't advance, but I could feel the pressure of their stares, the weight of their collective presence pressing down on me. And then, stepping forward from their ranks, came something else. It moved differently. Where the others stood still, this one walked with purpose. Not fast, not slow, just a steady, unbroken pace. Its shape was indistinct at first, blending with the fog and shadows, but as it drew closer, the details sharpened in ways that made my stomach twist. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs moved like they had too many joints, bending and shifting with each step, its gait wrong in ways my brain couldn't fully process. Its head, God, its head, wasn't shaped like a head at all. It was stretched, elongated, unnatural. And then I saw its mouth. It didn't have lips. Didn't have a normal human mouth at all. Just a wide, gaping slit that stretched across its face, teeth visible in rows, but they didn't bite, they were carved, fused into its flesh like they weren't meant for eating. Meant for something else. It was the one that had been whistling. I knew it. The sound had come from that mouth, from that thing, and now it was standing just yards away, whistling at me. I raised my rifle. My hands trembled, but I forced them still, aiming center mass, trying to remember every hunting instinct I had ever learned. My breathing was sharp and uneven, but I steadied it enough to squeeze the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence. The creature didn't react. My bullet hit it. I knew it did. I saw it land, saw the impact, but there was no wound, no sound of pain, no acknowledgement at all. It just kept walking. The whistling didn't stop, didn't even stutter. Panic flooded me. I fired again. And again. Nothing. I wasn't hurting it. Then it stopped. Just feet away from me, it stood still, its head tilting slightly as if it were considering something. My grip on the rifle tightened. My breaths came in ragged gasps. And then, it spoke. Not in words. Not in a voice. But in whistling. The sound changed. It wasn't the tuneless, aimless melody I had heard before, it was something else now, something specific. And as I listened, I felt something inside me shift. Memories slipped. Thoughts tangled. I knew this song. I knew it. But I didn't know how. The melody was pulling at something, a distant part of me I couldn't reach, something buried so deep that I didn't even know it existed until now. My vision blurred. My legs felt weak. I tried to focus, tried to hold on to something real, but the song didn't let me. And then the creature took another step forward. And this time, I couldn't move. I wanted to. My body screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything, but I was locked in place, frozen in some unnatural hold that had nothing to do with fear. The whistling wrapped around me like invisible chains, tightening, constricting, burrowing into my thoughts like a presence that was no longer outside of me but inside. I was forgetting something. Something important. A moment ago, I had been holding something, a weapon. Where was it? I looked down at my hands. They were empty. No rifle. No gear. No pack. I wasn't carrying anything. I wasn't even wearing the same clothes. Panic surged, but it was muted, drowned beneath the suffocating weight of the song. I didn't remember coming here. I didn't remember where I had been before this. How long had I been standing in this town? Had I been here before? The figures in the doorways, in the streets, on the porches, they weren't moving anymore. But their faces had changed. They were smiling. The whistling continued. And I forgot my own name. The whistling didn't stop. It swelled in my skull, winding through my mind like something alive, coiling and constricting around my thoughts. It was inside me, filling up hollow spaces I hadn't even known existed, twisting itself into the places where my own memories should have been. My name was slipping, unraveling like a thread being pulled, stretching further and further away until all that remained was a sinking sensation, the sickening certainty that I was losing something important. I gritted my teeth, trying to hold on to it, trying to anchor myself to anything real, but my mind was cracking, peeling away in layers I couldn't grab fast enough. I looked down at my hands, forcing myself to focus on something solid, something I could trust to still be my own. The moment my eyes landed on them, a cold, skin-tightening dread filled me because they weren't mine. My fingers were longer, thinner than they had ever been, stretched unnaturally over bones that didn't feel right beneath my skin. My pulse roared in my ears as I flexed them, watching how the tendons moved, how they shifted in ways they shouldn't, as if my body was being slowly adjusted into something that wasn't meant to be human anymore. I staggered back, shaking, desperate to convince myself I was imagining it, but the song told me I wasn't. The figures in the streets, they were still watching me, still standing in their unmoving rows, their mouths stretching into wider smiles that didn't belong on human faces. Their eyes held something unnatural, something deeper than hunger, something hollow, and for the first time, I realized that I recognized them. Not by their faces, those were all wrong, but by something buried beneath, something I couldn't name but knew had been familiar to me once. Hadn't I seen them before? Hadn't I known them? I needed to run. Even if I didn't know why, even if my mind was losing the reasoning behind it, the instinct was still screaming inside me. My body felt wrong, too heavy, too slow, but I turned toward the only place left to go. The houses. Their doors hung open, waiting, their darkened interiors stretching inward like mouths, yawning and endless. It was a terrible idea, but I had no other choice. There were no good ideas left. I stumbled toward the nearest doorway, my legs dragging like they no longer belonged to me, my steps feeling sluggish, disconnected from my will. Just as I reached the threshold, the whistling changed again. It was no longer just a sound, it was words. Not spoken aloud, not whispered, but carved into my thoughts as if they had always been there, waiting. Come inside. I didn't have time to resist. My body lurched forward as if pulled by an invisible thread, and the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Inside, the silence was absolute. No wind, no distant echoes, no lingering traces of the whistling, just a void of sound so complete it pressed against my ears like a weight, like something waiting to devour noise itself. The air was thick with the scent of dry rot, the kind that settles deep into the walls of a place where something had died long ago but had never fully left. My breath was uneven, my chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, my hands shaking as I turned, trying to understand what I was looking at. The furniture was wrong. Not because it was old, not because it was falling apart, but because it didn't belong here. A rusted school desk sat in the center of the room, its wooden top scarred with names carved long ago. A hospital bed rested against the wall, its mattress covered in stiff, brittle sheets stained by time. A church pew, cracked down the middle, stretched along the far corner, its wood warped and splintered from years of neglect. Every piece of it was familiar, but not from here. Not from this town. They were fragments of something else, scattered memories that should have belonged to different places, different lives. I backed away from them, my shoulder hitting a wall that shouldn't have been that close. The room was shrinking, the walls closing in like they were alive, pulsing, breathing, pressing closer with every beat of my heart. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, I saw something that made my stomach clench so violently I thought I might be sick. A mirror. It stood crookedly against the wall, its frame cracked, its surface covered in a dark film that might have once been dust but looked thicker, more organic. I took a step toward it, knowing I shouldn't, knowing that whatever I saw there wouldn't be something I wanted to face. But the pull was stronger than my fear. I had to look. I had to know. The reflection wasn't me. It had my clothes. It held my shape. But the longer I stared, the less human it became. My face stretched, warping, shifting like melting wax, my skin blurring into something that pulsed and rippled like it was trying to decide on a shape but couldn't settle on one. My mouth widened, but it wasn't a mouth anymore, it was something else, something gaping and unnatural, something that could whistle without lips. And then it smiled. Not at me. At itself. And I understood. I had already lost too much. The song had taken too much. I wasn't escaping this. I was becoming it. A noise creaked behind me, slow and deliberate, the sound of wood groaning under a shifting weight. I turned my head, my movements sluggish, my limbs no longer fully mine, and saw them, the figures from the town. They hadn't followed me inside. They had been here all along. They stood in the doorway, in the corners of the room, their faces stretched into impossible grins, their eyes black and endless. The silence shattered. The whistling started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my own head. Inside my own mouth. I tried to scream. But I only whistled back. The sound of the whistling inside me was wrong. Not something I was making, not something I could control, but something using me, shaping itself through my breath like my body had become just another empty vessel for it to pour through. My throat vibrated, my lips tingled, but I wasn't moving them. The sound emerged effortlessly, the same eerie, tuneless melody that had led me through the woods, through the road, through the dead town, and now into this place, this house that wasn't a house, this room that was shrinking, this moment that was swallowing me whole. The figures in the room didn't move. They didn't need to. Their grins stretched wider than mouths should stretch, their heads tilting, their eyes black and waiting. They had been waiting for a long time. I could feel it now, that this wasn't the first time someone had stood where I was standing, that others had been here before me. The furniture, the hospital bed, the school desk, the church pew, they weren't just random objects. They belonged to someone, to others who had come here, who had become this before me. I tried to stop whistling, tried to close my mouth, but my body didn't listen. The song kept pouring out of me, steady and endless. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an unraveling. Memories flickered in and out of focus, but they weren't clear. They weren't mine. I saw a little boy sitting at the school desk, his hands folded neatly, his face blank as he hummed along to the whistling. His mouth never opened, his lips sealed shut as the song came through him anyway. I saw a woman lying in the hospital bed, her fingers twitching against the sheets, her body withering away even though she wasn't sick. The fore in her arm was empty, connected to nothing, a silent mimicry of care. I saw a man in the church pew, his hands clasped together, rocking back and forth as if in prayer, his eyes black holes where light should have been. His head bobbed in time with the song, but he wasn't praying, he was listening. And I understood. The whistling was them. The song wasn't just a sound, it was everything they were, everything they had been before they became part of it. They weren't trapped here. They were this place now. And so was I. I felt it pulling at me, deeper, a heavy tide dragging me under, dissolving every piece of what made me me. My past became distant, flickering like a weak flame struggling against the wind. I had come here for something, hadn't I? A hunting trip. The thought surfaced and faded just as quickly. That couldn't be right. I had always been here. Hadn't I? No. No. That was the song talking, not me. A part of me screamed inside, raw and desperate, clawing for something real, something I could still hold on to. My name, what was my name? I fought to remember, but it was slipping away, crumbling like paper soaked in water, delicate and fragile. My body was heavy, my limbs sluggish, my breath slowing. The figures in the room knew. They had seen this before. They had watched others fight, watched them struggle, watched them give in. I couldn't let this happen. With every ounce of strength left in me, I forced my foot backward, one step. The movement felt unnatural, like pushing through thick mud, like my body didn't want to obey anymore. The whistling faltered. Just for a second. The figures twitched. They didn't like that. The pull of the song tightened, but now I knew it could be fought. I planted my other foot down hard, another step backward. The song stumbled, my breath hitching, my throat raw as the melody stuttered and broke for just an instant. The figures moved now, their heads snapping toward me, their smiles twisting into something that wasn't pleased anymore. I kept moving. One more step. Then another. My back hit the doorframe, and I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. The house shifted around me, the hallway stretching, the walls breathing, the door at the far end pushing further and further away. My feet pounded against the warped floor, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, but I kept going, forcing myself forward even as the house tried to hold on to me. The figures were behind me now, their silence broken. They didn't speak. They didn't scream. They just whistled. It was wrong now, sharp and jagged, not the eerie tune from before, but something angry, something frustrated, something that was losing its grip. My hands reached for the door, fingers outstretched, but before I could reach it, the floor dropped out from under me. I fell. The world swallowed me whole. I woke up gasping. Cold air hit my skin like a slap, sharp and biting. My body was sprawled out on damp ground, my limbs aching like I had been running for days. The weight of the whistling was gone, the pressure in my skull lifted, the song distant and fading. I sucked in a breath, then another, my lungs heaving, my throat raw. I was in the forest. Not in the house. Not in the town. Back in the forest. The road was gone. The town was gone. No broken houses, no figures waiting in doorways, no sign that any of it had ever been real. But my hands were shaking, and deep in my bones, I knew it had been. I pushed myself upright, my head still spinning, my vision swimming. My gear was gone. My rifle was gone. My pack, my GPS, my everything, gone. My clothes were torn, dirt smeared across my arms, my boots scuffed and worn. How long had I been out here? A noise. I froze. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the trees, far but not far enough. The whistling. Faint. Persistent. Still looking for me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I ran through the forest, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my legs screaming with exhaustion. Every step felt wrong, like my body wasn't fully mine anymore, like some part of me had been left behind in that town, in that house, in that song. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The whistling was behind me, distant but following, curling through the trees like a scent, like it could track me by the things I had already forgotten. The forest was different now. The trees loomed taller, the undergrowth thicker, the air heavier. It felt like the land had shifted, as if I had been dropped into some other version of the woods, a place that looked the same but wasn't. The trails I should have known weren't here. The ridges I should have recognized were gone. This wasn't where I had been hunting. This wasn't where I had started. I tried to remember how long I had been out here, how many days had passed, but the thoughts slipped away before I could hold on to it. I had to find my truck. That was all that mattered. If I could just find the trailhead, if I could get to the road, I could get in my truck and drive. I could leave this place behind. But the forest didn't want to let me go. The deeper I went, the thicker it became, the trees pressing in like walls, the sky vanishing behind a tangle of blackened branches. My boots sank into the damp earth, the smell of moss and rot thick in my lungs. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the figures from the town standing in the trees, watching, waiting. But they weren't there. Not yet. The whistling was closer now. I pressed forward, fighting through tangled brush, my hands torn by thorns, my body aching with every movement. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw it, a light. Faint. Flickering. Artificial. A cabin. For a split second, relief flooded me. I wasn't alone. Someone was out here. Someone who could help. But as I stumbled closer, the relief turned to something cold and heavy in my stomach. The cabin was wrong. It was old, ancient in a way that didn't belong to the rest of the forest. The wood was gray and splintered, the windows dark, the roof sagging inward. The door was wide open. Waiting. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my breath uneven, my instincts screaming no. The whistling had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then, inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. I took a step back. Then another. My body screamed at me to run, to turn and flee into the trees and never look back, but my legs locked up. There was something inside. Something waiting. A shadow moved past the doorway. Not fast. Not slow. Just moving, like it knew I was out here, like it knew I had nowhere else to go. My throat clenched. My hands curled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. I didn't have my rifle. I didn't have anything. Then, from inside the cabin, the sound of something breathing. A deep, slow, measured inhale. Something not quite human. It was waiting for me to come inside. I turned and ran. The forest closed around me, the branches clawing at my arms, my legs burning as I forced my way through the thick undergrowth. The silence followed, pressing against my skull, stretching out in a way that made it feel like sound itself had been sucked out of the world. Then, the whistling started again. But this time, it was ahead of me. My stomach dropped. My steps faltered. I hadn't been escaping it. It had been leading me. The path ahead opened up. I saw the road. The real road. Cracked pavement, old and worn but real. I saw my truck, parked exactly where I had left it. The sight of it almost made me collapse with relief. I could make it. I could get out. Then, movement. Something stood next to my truck. Tall. Waiting. I skidded to a stop, my breath caught in my throat, my legs trembling. The shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its mouth stretched wide even though it wasn't speaking. It wasn't whistling now. It didn't have to. I wasn't going to make it. I knew that now. It had led me here. Not to escape. To end this. The whistling started again. This time, it was coming from my own mouth. The whistling was coming from my own mouth. I could feel it in my throat, in my lungs, vibrating inside me like a sound I had always known, like it had been waiting for the right moment to take hold. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a struggle. It was effortless. A melody passing through me as if my body had always been meant to carry it. The thing standing by my truck didn't move. It didn't have to. It was waiting, watching, its body still but wrong, like it had been pulled and stretched into a shape that was only pretending to fit inside human skin. The road behind it was empty, stretching into the trees, leading back to a world I had come from, but would never reach again. I should have been afraid. I should have been running, screaming, fighting for my life. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to remember why. The song was inside me now. It was filling up the spaces where fear should be, pressing down on the edges of my thoughts, smoothing them out, making it all seem easier. I took a step forward. The thing by the truck mimicked me. Its head tilted, its body shifting in a way that wasn't quite movement, more like it had always been standing like that, and I had only just now noticed. It wasn't blocking the truck. It wasn't stopping me. It was just waiting for me to understand. I wasn't going to leave. There was no leaving. There had never been. Something clicked in my mind, a distant memory that wasn't mine. A shape in the fog, a town with no people, a road that stretched forever but went nowhere. The others had tried to leave, too. Others before me, hunters and hikers and lost travelers who had wandered too far from the world they knew. None of them had made it. Not because something stopped them. Because they had forgotten what they were running from. I tried to hold on to my own thoughts, tried to remember myself, but the song was pressing harder now, the melody curling through my breath, replacing words I should have known. My name, my life, my past, it was all slipping away, pulled into the same endless tune that had echoed through these woods long before I had ever arrived. I took another step. The thing by the truck smiled. I didn't know I had been afraid of anymore. The fear was gone, replaced with something else, something calm and light and endless. The town wasn't waiting for me. The house wasn't waiting for me. I had already been there. I had always been part of this. The song was my song now. I was whistling. And I was smiling. Somewhere, deep in the Allegheny National Forest, a truck sits abandoned by the side of an old road. The tires are caked in dry mud, the windshield covered in leaves, the driver's side door left slightly ajar, like someone had stepped out, but never came back. The supplies inside are untouched. The rifle still rests against the seat. There are footprints leading into the woods, but none coming back out. The wind moves through the trees, carrying a faint, tuneless melody through the empty spaces where no one should be. Somewhere, something is whistling. And somewhere, something is listening. Waiting for the next traveler. Waiting for the next song.